All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, from somewhat Washington, D.C., coming from my basement, actually in Frederick, Maryland, as we all are doing these days, doing all of these Zoom webinars. For those of you I have not met, my name is Harry Kazianis. I'm Senior Director of Korean Studies here virtually at the Center for the National Interest. Welcome to our continuing series of webinars tackling all things that are North Korea, U.S.-North Korea relations, U.S.-ROK alliance relations, and much more. Really, anything that has to do with the Korean Peninsula, we are talking about either on our webinars, online at nationalinterest.org, our platform for all of our national security publishing, and also on our Korea Watch platform as well. So today, our panel discussion is going to attempt to address probably perhaps one of the most fascinating and I think most controversial issues when it comes to North Korea, as so many issues with North Korea are so controversial, and that's North Korea's ongoing military modernization. In fact, I would argue it's this modernization, and I think the evidence really bears this out. Why back in 2017, the United States and North Korea came so close to nuclear war. I know that some people debate that, but I think that's very, very true. Now, North Korea, after really years of starts and stops, public failures, spending billions of dollars that could have gone to a population where 4 in 10 people actually have nutritional challenges or food insecurity, as we like to call it, and an economy that's actually smaller than my home state of Rhode Island is now on the cusp of having a nuclear weapon mated to an ICBM that could potentially hit the United States. I know there's some debate on that, whether they've tested the heat shield technology and other things, but I think it's fair to say that they are either pretty close or have that capability. Now, when I've spoken to Trump administration officials on this for many years now, I think it's very clear that North Korean ICBMs are the driving factor why in 2017 the Trump administration made North Korea such a focus of its foreign policy. And if you really probe Trump administration officials, and some of the conversations at least I've had on background, the red lines for this administration are two things: nuclear weapons tests and ICBM tests. They explicitly have used that word red line to me. Now, of course, they don't tell me what they're going to do if North Korea were to go across that red line once again, but they've made that pretty clear, I would say. Now, while these weapons, I think, for the moment, aren't making front page headlines in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, they really are on the minds of really every capital in East Asia and in the United States. And they're worried about what could come next. I mean, we have on October 10th coming up a very big military parade. There's all these different satellite images that have come out in 38 North, different outlets that show that the North Koreans are preparing for something. We don't know exactly what, but I think we could make some rather intelligent guesses of what that could be. But at least for the last couple of months, this hasn't made major headlines, on par with, say, Donald Trump's tax returns or something like that. But when I have talked to White House officials, and I've really probed them about their biggest fears when it comes to North Korea for actually a book project I'm working on, I was actually talking to a senior official just a day ago, and they jokingly said to me, North Korea testing an ICBM during Tuesday's presidential debate is their biggest fear. Now, they were kidding, they were joking, but I think it goes to show, just in jest, they're still sort of worried about where North Korea could be going in terms of their military modernization. So I think today's panel, where we're going to go with this is pretty simple. I think it'd be good to explore how we got here. What were the steps? What were the things that were missed? What were the policy failures? How did North Korea go from the late 1990s with potentially 1 million or more people dead due to food insecurity, due to famine, to a country that has nuclear weapons and ICBMs? I mean, that's a pretty profound turn. So I think the way we're going to handle this is we're going to do this panel in sort of a past, present, future sort of style. Each panelist is going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes or so. They're going to give their analysis on the situation, and we're going to have them essentially go in that order. So just to introduce everybody and to get a sense of who everybody's in this panel, it's a great panel. These are 3 people I've worked with and respected for many years. Actually, Gordon Chang and Jim Holmes, I want to single them out as they've been mentors to me for many, many years. And I can honestly say I would not be sitting here today if it wasn't for both of those 2 fine gentlemen. So thanks for being on this panel with me. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to start with Gordon Chang first. I think everybody knows Gordon very well. provides excellent analysis on Asia, on China, and North Korea. He wrote a book a few years ago, Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, which is excellent. And we're going to have Gordon start and lay this out for us. What Gordon's going to do, and I know he's going to do a great job, is how did we get here? What were the actual policy failures that led us to this moment in time where we're actually worrying about North Korean ICBMs? Then we're going to kick it over to Bruce Bennett. Bruce has been covering these issues for a long time as a defense analyst at RAND. He has done some amazing work on a little bit different issue, which is Korean unification. Did a big paper back in 2013, which really is amazing. If you can check that out, it's really good. And I think did another paper, Bruce can correct me, I think that was in 2017, sort of an updated version on that. And I think it's a preeminent expert on North Korea, hands down. And then we're going to end this with Jim Holmes, my good friend. And what he's going to talk about is what are U.S. policy options? Where does the United States stand in all this? So I think that sort of encompasses sort of a broad gambit on this issue. So with that, Gordon, I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to kick it over to you, my friend.
Well, thank you very much, Harry, and thank you to the center. 3 years ago this month, North Korea tested what it said was a thermonuclear device. And there are reasons to believe that Pyongyang was telling the truth when it said it had mastered hydrogen bomb technology. Now, whether it was hydrogen bomb or whether boosted fission, we don't know. But we do know one thing. It was a powerful device, about 250 kilotons. Now, 2017, as you pointed out, Harry, was a big year. In November, North Korea launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, the Hwasong-15. Hwasong-15, from what we can tell, has the range to reach all of the continental United States. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know whether they can mate this missile and the nuke together. We don't know how good their guidance is. We don't know if their heat shielding works. But there is one thing we do know. We do know that Kim Jong-un's technicians in that 3-year period have been working continuously to improve their weapons. And let's remember a few things. First of all, if Kim is going to target a population center, he doesn't need perfect guidance. He doesn't need heat shielding if he has an EMP attack in mind. And also, no matter what his technical shortcomings may be, we know that one of the things he could do is take a crude atomic device, disassemble it, smuggle parts into the United States, and reassemble it in the city of his choice. And indeed, if he were going to attack the US with a nuke, I think that's what he would do. Now, the question is, Harry, because you talked about this before, question is, how can one of the most destitute societies on the planet, over the course of decades, managed to build these weapons in defiance of the most powerful nation in history? Well, the quick answer is there was North Korean deception and persistence, there was Chinese assistance and ruthlessness, and there was American indecision, inattention, and incompetence. So first, let's start with North Korea. Regime founder Kim Il-sung probably started his nuclear weapons program no later than 1965. And there are some indications he was thinking about this as soon as the armistice was signed for the Korean War in 1953. But whatever the case is, the North Koreans have been thinking about this for a very long time. Second, China. We know that China helped the nuclear weapons program. We know the North Koreans got their uranium enrichment technology from the AQ-Khan network, which was selling China's tech. And we know that China knew that Pakistan's network was selling this to the North Koreans because AQ-Khan himself, when he went to Pyongyang, and he went there about 3 or 4 times at least, he traveled through Beijing's capital airport to and from the North Korean state. Moreover, we know that China at very critical times stepped in to provide diplomatic support, to run interference for North Korea in diplomatic fora. For instance, the UN Security Council and the governing board of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then finally, of course, China supported the North Korean economy, supported it with trade and investment. Some of this was legal, some of this was indeed sanctions busting below the board. So the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has nuclear weapons because of the People's Republic of China. Now, yes, of course, the North Koreans and the Chinese are villains. We all know that. But what is hard to understand is why the United States allowed them to be villainous. Why did we continually make mistakes? And that brings us, of course, to the third country, the United States. North Korea has been building its missiles and its nukes under the noses of at least 5 American presidents, starting most notably with George H.W. Bush. Now, from the 1980s onwards, the North Koreans were clearly lying to the international community. North Koreans lied. We knew they were lying. The North Koreans knew that we knew they were lying, but they continued to do so anyway. So why did we Americans put up with this? Several explanations. First of all, victory in the Cold War convinced Americans that nobody around the world could hurt them anymore. So we went on what people have called the holiday from history, and we did that for about a decade. And second of all, North Korea was rarely at the top of the inbox, especially after 9/11. And third, because we're a democracy, we've got different presidents, we had inconsistent foreign policy. And sometimes we were hostile to the North Koreans, sometimes we were generous, but we weren't consistent. And this was perfect for the Kim regime, because we were hostile enough so that they could rally the North Korean people behind the regime itself, but we were never hostile enough to really threaten the existence of the regime. So the North Koreans found this to be pretty good. And also, we also had policies that sometimes put North Korea in a secondary position. And for this, I'm going to pick on George W. Bush, because he saw China as more important than North Korea. Now, W, of course, did not ignore the North Koreans. One of the first things he did was he actually started the process for the 6-party talks, which began in August 2003. But we got to remember that these talks, at least from the American point of view, had 2 purposes. One of them, of course, was to disarm the North Koreans. And I think more important in the Bush administration's calculation, it was to integrate China into the international system. And this integration motivation explains why Beijing was put in the center of the international community's efforts to disarm the North Korea. All of 6-party talks were hosted on Chinese soil. Now, Bush 43, of course, he knew that the Chinese had great influence over the North Koreans. That's indisputable. Question is, were they willing to use that influence? And unfortunately, Chinese policy by then had not evolved to the point where they were willing to openly intervene in the affairs of another country, especially to help the United States. And of course, in Beijing, there was no consensus that it was in China's interest to undermine an ally, matter of fact, their only military ally, the DPRK, to help us. What Bush's audacious plan was he was counting on a fundamental shift in Chinese foreign policy. Now, at that time, people can say China began that shift, but it hadn't completed it. It hadn't completed it to the position where China no longer saw itself as outside of the international system, as an adversary of that system, and it couldn't shed its self-image as being hostile to the American-led system. Now, a lot of people will argue that these changes of sort of shedding the image of an outsider, those happen over time as internal perception shifted. But China, at the time of the Bush administration, and of course now, hadn't come to the point of view that they calculated their interests in the same way that we did. And I think that Bush's main fault was not to recognize that his policy was based on the false assumption. So in effect, he let China get in the way of his North Korea policy. If you move on to President Obama, with the exception of the fatally flawed Leap Day deal in 2012, he really didn't care very much about North Korea. President Trump is fascinating. President Trump, as we all know, is trying to woo Kim Jong-un. And I think that we should look at Trump policy, like Bush 43 policy, in that there was a more important goal than disarming the North Koreans in Trump's mind and in Bush's mind. And with regard to Trump, I think that you can see that he is trying to peel Kim Jong-un away from China's Xi Jinping. That's more important than taking away Kim Jong-un's weapons. And if you look at Trump policy in that context, it makes sense. Even though, of course, from the sense of trying to disarm North Korea, it's been a failure. So what should America do now about North Korea? And I'd like to take, as we do this, we'll take a look at what we did in the past, which also helps explain how we got to where we are now. Of course, we need to realize that there are no good policy options with regard to North Korea. And there are no good policy options because a series of presidents have made some horrible decisions. So my answer is that we don't get to pick among good options. We get to pick among what is the least worst one. And in my view, the least worst one is the vigorous enforcement of sanctions. If you have no money for Kim Jong-un, it means no money for gift politics, which he uses to bolster the regime. No money for Kim Jong-un means no money for missiles, no money for nukes. It means that for the first time, we force a Kim leader to make a decision between keeping his weapons and keeping his regime. And no American president has forced a Kim to face that choice. Now, I believe Trump maintained one of the best, if not the best, North Korea policies prior to May 2018, because then there was vigorous enforcement of sanctions. And according to the Wall Street Journal, the US cut North Korea's foreign revenue by about a half. But in May 2018, Trump pivoted. That was the month that his administration decided to not go forward with designating, in other words, sanctioning, almost 36 Chinese, Russian, and other front companies. And because Kim Jong-un changes his front companies all the time, Trump's decision was really to give Kim Jong-un a reprieve. Now, like all things Trump was very upfront with what he did. He said at the Canada G7, and this was June of 2018, he said, I'm giving Kim a one-time shot to do the right thing. And this was just a few days before the historic June summit in Singapore. Well, what we have seen since then is that Kim has not taken advantage of that one shot. We're talking about 2 years. And at the same time, Trump has not pivoted and gone back to a vigorous enforcement of sanctions. Now, you can't get North Korea to give up its weapons unless you are willing to impose costs on North Korea. And you can't affect North Korea without also affecting its relationship with China. Now, on June 29th, 2017, a day that I'll remember for a very long time, the Trump administration designated Bank of Dandong, a small Chinese institution, as a primary money laundering concern under Section 311 of the Patriot Act. That cut it off from the global financial system. And obviously, Bank of Dandong is not important. It was a warning. Now, since that time, Trump has gone really soft on bank enforcement because we know from Bloomberg reporting that the administration has the goods on North Korean money laundering for all 4 of the big 4 Chinese banking institutions, but there's been no penalties. Now, I know in May of this year, the administration got 33 indictments, 5 against Chinese bankers, 28 against North Korean bankers. But in the scheme of things, those indictments are small beer. You got to go after the money. You got to remember President Obama. How did he convince the Iranians to sign the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2015? Well, President Obama did that because he imposed multi-billion-dollar fines on European banks for laundering Iranian money. So it seems to me that if we want to get serious, and this is history, but it's also the future, if we want to get serious about disarming the North Koreans, we got to go after their money. If we're serious about going after their money, we have to go after the Chinese banks. And I can't put my hand over my heart and say this 100% will work, but I can say that we owe it to ourselves to try something that's worked in the past and something which hasn't failed before. All of our other options have failed before. Thanks very much, Harry.
Always great, Gordon. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Well, Bruce, you're on deck. Wow us.
Well, thank you. I'm going to take a little bit from history and then move forward to where I see us now and in the near future. So to start with, early in the Cold War, the United States concluded that the world would be better off with fewer rather than more nuclear weapon states. So the United States offered a nuclear umbrella to its various allies, and most accepted it because they knew the costs and risks of becoming a nuclear weapon state. During that period, the Soviet conventional force superiority led the United States to plan nuclear weapon use against a Soviet invasion into Western Europe. As the Cold War moved into the early 1960s, the Soviets fielded missiles able to deliver nuclear weapons to US territory. At that time, many experts and politicians became concerned about the US will to use nuclear weapons to stop the Soviets if that could trigger Soviet attacks on the United States. As Charles de Gaulle put it, he was skeptical that the United States would trade New York for Paris. That is, he was skeptical that the United States would risk a Soviet nuclear attack on New York by using nuclear weapons on the battlefield in Germany to stop Soviet advance that would eventually threaten Paris. So let's turn to Korea. In Korea, the Kim family leaders have emphasized the acquisition of nuclear weapons for decades. As Gordon has suggested, this has been a long-term effort by them. While the regime argues that it needs nuclear weapons to deter a US attack, the North has a broader set of objectives in mind. Just before dying in 2011, North Korean leader Kim Jong-il prepared a list of final instructions for his son, Kim Jong-un. Two of those stand out. Number one, develop a nuclear arsenal, long-range missiles, and biochemical weapons endlessly. That's an interesting set of objectives that Kim has stuck with. Number two, unification of the two Koreas is the ultimate goal of our family. Now, he's not talking about a South Korea-led unification. He is talking about a North Korea-led unification. Most people dismiss that as not being very feasible anymore, but let's take a look at what he has been doing. In 2015, North Korea apparently fielded a new war plan that was designed to, quote, complete a southern invasion within a week using asymmetric capabilities, including nuclear weapons. The North did thorough analyses of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It concluded that it won't have a chance if war drags on. To end it quickly, Pyongyang reached a decision that asymmetric warfare is the only answer, despite the pressures and condemnations of the international community. Under the new war plan, the North plans to use asymmetric capabilities, including nuclear weapons and missiles, to forestall South Korean and US troops in the early stage of war. Now, the United States has been worried about potential North Korean use of nuclear weapons. So in the US 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, the United States established a deterrent against North Korean nuclear weapon use. It says, quote, our deterrent strategy for North Korea makes clear that any North Korean nuclear attack against the United States or its allies and partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of that regime. Now, this is logical. That's what the Kim regime depends upon, what it's concerned about. And so to threaten that is a useful threat. Unfortunately, there is another set of problems. 3 years ago, I had several interviews with a former North Korean who I was told was the senior military defector up to that point. He had also served on a senior staff and knew about the North Korean strategy directly. He told me that Kim Jong-un had concluded that the United States no longer had the stomach for high attrition warfare based upon the US experiences in Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So I went looking for material to clarify this perspective. In 1997, the senior North Korean military defector at the time testified to Congress that some Americans believe that even if North Korea possessed the ability to strike the United States, it would never dare to because of the devastating consequences. But I do not agree with this idea. Kim Jong-il believes that if North Korea creates more than 20,000 American casualties in the region, the US will roll back and North Korea will win the war. Now you might say, okay, can he do that? The answer comes very quickly. A single nuclear weapon could cause this level of damage if detonated on the major US military base in South Korea, Camp Humphreys. I think the US would seriously retaliate against such an attack, but Kim might doubt it if he follows the logic above. More broadly, the United States has provided its allies, South Korea and Japan, with a nuclear umbrella. But what if North Korea detonated a nuclear weapon on a South Korean airfield well outside a city, or as an electromagnetic pulse attack to cripple the rock electrical grid or parts thereof? If that attack killed only a few thousand South Koreans, would the United States have the will to eliminate the North Korean regime as threatened, potentially causing hundreds of thousands of North Korean casualties? Would the United States do so recognizing that it would potentially be violating the law of armed conflicts dictate that retaliation should be proportional and reflect military necessity? Once North Korea has 20 or 30 operational ICBMs with nuclear weapons, the US president would likely expect that North Korea could then retaliate against US cities. So we go back to the 1950s analogy I drew earlier. At that point, Kim may be convinced that the United States would not retaliate against the regime. Would a US president be prepared to trade New York or San Francisco for protection of Seoul? A significant North Korean ICBM capability could fundamentally change the ability of the United States to deter North Korean actions. We do not know if North Korea has such an ICBM capability yet, as Gordon has argued, but stay tuned for the October 10 North Korean parade. But another very senior North Korean defector has told me that Kim already has acquired 30 transporter erector launchers for moving around and launching mobile ICBMs. Now, you never know for sure in talking with defectors, but if it does have that capability, would that change the will of a US president to honor the nuclear umbrella commitments? And if so, what should the US allies plan? Do they need their own nuclear weapons to deter North Korea? What could lead to a nuclear arms race in Northeast Asia between South Korea, Japan, China, and North Korea? How important is it to the United States to avoid such a competition and the potential destabilization that large numbers of nuclear weapons could potentially cause in future regional provocations, confrontations, and other crises? But as I said before, Kim wants more. His father directed him to achieve unification, and he certainly did not mean South Korea-led unification. Might Kim believe that a force of 30 to 50 ICBMs with nuclear weapons would allow him to break the US-ROC alliance and then compel Korean unification? He might. A 2019 Workers' Party training document goes further. Quote, "The dear Supreme Leader will dominate the world with nuclear weapons, will make the US apologize and compensate us for decades of bullying our people, and will declare to the entire world that the world's powerful order will be reshaped by the Juche Korea, not the United States." Now, the first reaction of most Americans to this extreme statement is to thoroughly discount it. But Kim may believe that a modest-sized force of nuclear ICBMs would allow him to not only deter US attacks, but also coerce US and South Korean actions because of US and South Korean casualty aversion. Look only at last week and one fatality. For someone who regularly purges and even kills senior North Korean elites, Kim must be impressed by the US and South Korea complaining so much about North Korean sailors killing just one South Korean official. Does he see leverage in an ability to threaten the lives of hundreds of thousands unfazed by losing comparable numbers of his own people in a US nuclear retaliation. In short, the US and South Korea need to rethink our strategy for countering North Korean nuclear weapons. A failure to do so could lead to catastrophic consequences. In particular, as the US did during the Cold War, the US should be posturing its military for nuclear warfighting against North Korea and not just for retaliation. Hopefully by doing so, the United States will convince Kim that even his use of nuclear weapons in a conflict would not defeat the United States and South Korea's conventional superiority, and thus would be a losing proposition. But until we can convince Kim that his nuclear weapons are a liability and not key to his survival, it's going to be very hard to get him to even shut down production of nuclear weapons, let alone roll back his nuclear forces. This is the quandary I think the United States faces now, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Bruce. That's always wonderful. I appreciate that. All right, Dr. Holmes, bring it home for us. Solve this riddle if you can. What do we do about North Korea going forward?
Oh, yeah, we can do that. And that was a tough couple of acts to follow, as I'm sure the attendees can have realized. Fred, let me talk to you as a strategist. Today, a friend of mine and some contributors did a book on nuclear strategy a few years ago through Georgetown, Strategy in the Second Nuclear Age, riffing on Paul Bracken's book by that name. And it was really a sobering project, as you can kind of imagine. So let me talk to you as a strategist. First of all, I guess I would have a list of maybe principles or things to think about as we make North Korea's strategy in the coming years. First of all, is I think you have to keep strategy is about keeping setting and enforcing priorities, keeping the top priorities at the top, and taking a more jaundiced eye towards secondary priorities. So it's a matter of self-discipline. I think that I would say that we have to keep in mind that North Korea is a secondary commitment. If you read our national defense strategy, it tells us we're in a great power competition, primarily with China and also with Russia, and Iran and North Korea are farther down the list of priorities. So I think when we think about this, we have to put it in the context of China competition, especially with China. Are we actually in such a good position vis-a-vis China that we can divert policy and energy and resources of all types into this effort to disarm North Korea? So I don't know whether, and in fact, I don't disagree with the strategic options that I've heard from my fellow panelists at all. But I do think we need to keep that sort of set of priorities first and forefront, or at the forefront of our thinking about this. I personally don't see ourselves in that strong a position vis-a-vis China and Russia that we really can afford to divert a whole lot of resources and effort into this disarmament project. Box it in, try to slow it down, and so forth. But I don't think that you can afford to make this a top priority for U.S. policy and strategy. Secondly, I guess a related point would be to just accept reality. If you look back at nuclear history, of course, Paul Bracken says we're in a second nuclear age and so forth. But if you look back, how many cases can you think of in which a power that had already gone to the effort, expended all the right resources to build nuclear weapons, actually revoked their nuclear arsenal? And it's a very of us nuclear weapon states. It's one. And that was South Africa, and that was basically an assisted suicide move on the part of the apartheid regime, which didn't want its successor to have its small nuclear arsenal, so they disbanded it in order to keep that from happening. So again, and that which is a really bizarre case. So it's for reasons we can get into during the Q&A if you want to. But again, so I think that like Gordon said and like Bruce said, I think we can try to limit what the North Koreans have, what they do in the future, and so forth. But as far as getting them to do a total disarmament, I just don't see it happening. I mean, we had this debate every time a new country, especially a non-Western country, joins the nuclear club. Do they accept the logic of mutual assured destruction? And we always worry about that, as you know, with Pakistan and North Korea and so forth. But at the same time, I think that they generally have, and I think that's actually kind of a comforting thing as we move ahead. So if you think about, and we didn't hear too much about the military option, except that both Gordon and Bruce sort of shied away from it, and they were entirely correct to do that. If you think about what happened during the Korean War in the 1950s, and I think this would be sort of the floor as far as casualties and costs and so forth. About 37,000 Americans gave up their lives on the Korean Peninsula during that three-year conflict, and that doesn't even count Koreans, Chinese, everybody else that was involved in the conflict. Do we actually care enough about disarming North Korea totally to take military action that would involve at least that number of casualties? And I think the answer is probably no. I mean, it's simply for the reasons that I've set out. Even if you confine the problem to the Korean Peninsula, but also if you take this in the context of the larger great power strategic competition. I should point out Bruce almost made the point that this has been a calculation that our past adversaries, or actually a miscalculation that our past adversaries have made vis-a-vis the United States. We're fighting. I don't think we have the stomach for fighting to that degree, but at the same time, the United States also has a way of surprising its opponents. Think about Al-Qaeda calculating that we would not have the stomach to wage war on terror, which we have now done for about 19 years. Saddam Hussein did the same thing in 1990 and 1991 when he launched into the invasion of Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia and his other neighbors. Didn't think we could handle 10,000 casualties. He was reading back to Vietnam, of course, at that point. So I think that's something that we should also keep in mind as well. Ask ourselves, do we have the stomach? Do we care enough about disarming North Korea to actually do what it takes? If you do it by force, if you look at the configuration of the North Korean nuclear arsenal, it's probably in the northern reaches of the country along the Chinese border, and therefore would entangle China in any military engagement between ourselves and the North Koreans. As we heard, they're doing mobile launchers, which are really hard to root out, as we found out in Western Iraq during Desert Storm. All of these things are military considerations to keep in mind as well. The next point that I would bring up would be simply deterrence. I mentioned the logic of mutual assured destruction. I think we should put at the center of our efforts vis-a-vis Pyongyang to try to get them to understand, leave no doubt in their minds that the United States would retaliate under certain conditions, such as Gordon mentioned, smuggling a nuke and detonating in an American city. Things like this, if we can convey to Pyongyang equivalent to dropping a nuclear device using an ICBM or perhaps an aircraft, but most likely a missile, I think that helps to remove a lot of doubt from the situation and improve the likelihood of deterrence. Deterrence is always a very difficult thing, obviously, because it involves playing head games with your opponent. But I think that should really be at the center of what we try to do in the future. And the last point, I guess, it's sort of a hardy perennial for me, or anybody who does Asia work, would be to concentrate on alliance building, alliance preservation, and alliance breaking. Alliance building, I mean, we're always wishing, and rightly so, for a true tripartite alliance between the United States, Japan, and North Korea. I think that would certainly, or not North Korea, good grief, South Korea. Yeah, North Korea, I think that's a little bit out of the question. I think that if we could achieve, I mean, that would be a great place to devote a lot of diplomatic effort in Northeast Asia. It would not only create a united front vis-a-vis North Korea, instead of having feuding between two of our allies right there across the Tsushima Strait from each other. It would enhance our strategic position for the competition with China and Russia. It would just pay off in a host of ways. So I think that is worth doing. That's worth doing just as a general point as well. As far as breaking alliances, Gordon said something about breaking alliances. I certainly think that a focus of strategic competition is to rally as many friends and allies to your own cause, while appealing them away from your adversary's cause, and thus improving your stance vis-a-vis your opponent. So I think that to the event that we can look for things that we can do punitively or incentives we can offer Pyongyang, I think that's worth exploring. I would defer to my two fellow panelists who are obviously much more well versed in North Korea than I am, on the things that we could actually do to reach out to Pyongyang and improve the prospects for weaning them away from their dependency on China. And this is actually a little bit off the subject, but there was just in closing, Gordon said something that's actually worth reiterating. When we think about the United States' strategic position in the world, not just Asia, but really in the world. In 1992, I was a young lieutenant here in Rhode Island on active duty teaching engineering, and the United States Navy and Marine Corps issued a document, and this was almost exactly the time that Frank Fukuyama published his famous article in the National Interest, and then the book following on it, about the end of history. almost at exactly the same time in 1992 that the book appeared, the Navy and the Marine Corps said, history is over. Naval history is over. The Soviet Navy is gone. We no longer have anybody to fight, and therefore we can think of the sea all the way around the world as a safe sanctuary from which to project power into the rimlands of primarily of Western Europe and East Asia, but also South Asia and places like that. They essentially said that history had basically repealed the first and foremost function of navies and Marines, which is to fight for command of the sea. You have to win maritime command before you can exercise maritime command. And I think we actually did that as a country, as a military, and as a diplomatic apparatus all around. It was just bizarre. You don't get holidays from history, and if you do, they do not last for very long. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Even if we prevail in the competition with China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, whoever, we have to be ready to go back to competing after that happens. Simply because the things that we're asking of our adversaries are not things that they value in a trifling manner. These are things of permanent and great importance to them, and you simply can't expect them to surrender them for very long. So the best we can do, I think, is to try to kick the can down the road, and hope that good things will happen somewhere down the road. If we can deter Pyongyang today, tomorrow, in a few days, sooner or later, it starts looking like a pretty serious effort at deterrence, and perhaps things will happen that will improve the conditions in the region and improve the prospects for peace over the long haul. So with that ramble, I will surrender head left. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate that. So I want to move now to Q&A. Now, I know sometimes with these online forums, we forget about how to do Q&A. Everybody has their own platform. On the bottom of your screen, there should be a little bubble that says Q&A. So if you have any questions, type them in. I'll get them, and I'm happy to ask our panelists. Let me kick it off with the first question. This is actually one from my colleague, Trevor, who's an editorial assistant at the National Interest. And a couple other people have sort of asked this in different formats. So I'm going to ask all three of you. Gordon, I'll ask you, then Bruce, then Jim. It goes something like this. There's a lot of analysts here in Washington, and I think I'm probably in this sort of perspective, if you will, that unfortunately, due to all the policy failures that we've had with North Korea, all these different mistakes, as Gordon, as you laid out so well, we're kind of in a vice with North Korea. They have now a large amount of nuclear weapons. I mean, I think the numbers vary, but they probably have enough fissile material for maybe as many as 65 nuclear weapons. They have this growing ICBM capability. Are we at the point now where it's time to seriously start talking about arms control? In other words, I know, Gordon, you're not going to like this, but I'm dying to get your response. De facto accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state and working towards arms control. What do you think about that? And I want everybody to respond, but Gordon, you first, if you don't mind. I
love the notion of arms control, but I don't think the North Koreans are going to be responsible counterparties. They have violated every agreement that they've signed on this. So I don't think that we can go that route. I think what we can do, and Jim sort of suggested this, is that you just continue to deter the North Koreans until perhaps they fall apart. And we deal with it that way. And of course, that was the way the Cold War ended, in a sense. Now, it means Russia still has its nukes, but we have obtained accommodations and understandings with Moscow. And maybe we could do the same with Pyongyang. Maybe they would do something like South Africa or Ukraine did, which is actually to surrender their arsenals. So I think that really is the way to go. What concerns me, Harry, about trying to outlast the North Koreans is that right now we've got a president in South Korea who is very pro-North Korea, who wants to unify the two halves of the Korean peninsula. And because of that, we may find that we're off the peninsula anyway because of Moon Jae-in. But whatever goes on in the southern portion of the peninsula, I think we need to continue to deter. We need to try to take its resources away, which I talked about. We need to separate China and North Korea. And I think we need to go after the Chinese, because that's really the problem. You know, we don't have a North Korea problem. And I even say we probably don't even have much of an Iranian problem, but we do got a China problem. And we deal with China, then we deal, I think, automatically almost with both Tehran and Pyongyang. So really, this is a long-term campaign, as Holmes has talked about. We can wage it. We've done this before. And indeed, because the North Koreans can hold us at ransom, we have a lot of incentive to do that.
I think that's fair. Bruce, what do you think about this? Is it time for arms control?
Oh, we already have an agreement. Back in 2018, in April, North Korea and South Korea signed the Panmunjom Declaration. In that, it says, Article 1.1, North and South Korea will fully implement all previous agreements and declarations. The 1992 North-South Denuclearization Declaration said, North Korea will have no nuclear weapons, no production capability, no uranium enrichment, no plutonium reprocessing. It's only going to have peaceful use of weapons. So Kim signed that agreement in April 2018, knowing it was a lie, that he had no intention of doing that. And then he turns around at January 1st, 2019, in his New Year's address, which is his State of the Union address, and says, they're not going to produce any more nuclear weapons. They're not going to use nuclear weapons. Obviously, they haven't stopped production. We have lots of testimonies that they are producing. My concern is we have given them since March of 2018, when Kim said he was prepared to dismantle with an agreement with the US. Since that time, my rough estimate is he's increased his nuclear destructive potential somewhere between about 70 and 100%. We've given him that time. Can we afford to do the same moving forward? Can we go out to 2027 when North Korea, according to some estimates, might have 150 or 200 nuclear weapons? Is that a world which we are prepared to live with? And I would argue I don't like that one, but trying to stop him from getting there, my argument is in deterrence, you have denying benefits and imposing costs. We have focused on imposing costs. We now need to look at denying benefits. By benefits, I mean, we need to illustrate to Kim that the things he wants to get out of nuclear weapons, he's not going to get, including he's not going to force South Korea into a unification. He's not going to dominate the peninsula. He's not going to force the US and South Korea to break our alliance. We don't say that all very much, and we probably should.
Fair enough. Dr. Holmes, what do you say?
Are you cut out? Did you come to me?
Yes, sir. What do you think about all this?
The sound's cutting in and out just a little bit this afternoon. Well, you know, I'm actually a victim of conflicting ideologies. I'm an old gunnery officer, a naval gunnery officer, and when I hear arms control, I think about fire control. I mean, it's about aiming effectively. But I also did arms control work at Georgia, at the University of Georgia, before moving back to Newport, and I find that that's actually an ideology as well. So if you ask me whether it's time for arms control, I sort of reflexively say yes. But as Bruce points out, and as Gordon pointed out, I think the burden has to be on the other side, simply because they have solemn agreements that they have not honored. I think that it's kind of up to them to make to basically show good faith and honor the commitments that they've actually made. As far as Gordon actually to look at this in the long-term perspective, Gordon alluded to, and Bruce alluded to also, the Cold War. Of course, the theory under the strategy of containment was simply that if we could box in Soviet communism, deny it the sort of restlessness, the expansiveness of Marxism, Leninism, the regime would mellow out over time, and perhaps become something that we could live with, or else it would fall entirely. I think that's possibly, I mean, if you want to take a George Kennan approach to North Korea, I think there's a lot of merit to that, given that the military option is so forbidding and so forth. However, I think that one thing that we've been predicting, the mellowing or the fall of the Kim regime for many years, if not decades now. It's proven really resilient to a degree that it's kind of shocked me as well. When people talk about the regime in Beijing mellowing or falling as well, that's usually my rejoinder to them is, well, you know what, the regime in Beijing is probably a lot more resilient than the Kim regime, and look at that, and look what's happened there. So perhaps, I mean, it's because of the maritime geography of North Korea. It can box in its people and impose the sort of Orwellian state that they have, but I think so perhaps that's the best option we have, but I'm not entirely sure we will see a Soviet outcome to the competition with North Korea, especially since people in Beijing and in Pyongyang and places like that have studied it, and they said there will be no Gorbachevs in the closing stages of this competition, whatever it is. So I think quite clearly the Chinese have studied it. I'm certainly sure that the North Koreans have as well. So I think that's sort of where we are. So yes, arms control, but you know what, the burden falls on the other side to show that it's serious about arms control. And at that point, we'll see where we go. But until then, I think Gordon is entirely right about maritime sanctions enforcement and so forth. Just try to box in the problem.
I think that's fair, Jim. I think also the problem is when you get into a situation like arms control, the North Koreans haven't exactly been the easiest to deal with in terms of getting inspectors on the ground to go into the facilities that we need to. I mean, they've thrown out inspectors how many different times? So I think, we could potentially get to the agreements, but are the agreements in force? As Bruce pointed out, we have a lot of agreements with the North Koreans. Nothing ever happens. So I think these are very logical questions. Let me get to a question from General Wallace Gregson, a friend of all of ours and a senior director here at the center. Here's what he asks. While we're cracking down on banks and financial institutions supporting North Korea's illicit arms industry, should we not put together an international coalition to put pressure on North Korea's declared and covert diaspora producing resources for North Korea? UN sanctions following the VX attack in Malaysia directed nations to send home their North Korean laborers in their countries. That has not happened, of course, but not a word raised anywhere about this is being ignored. Gordon, take that on. What do you think about that?
Well, I think obviously we need to do that as well, because it's a question of denying the North Korean regime dollars. And we also know that both China and Russia have violated the sanctions on North Korean laborers. One thing that we have been reluctant to do is to impose costs on China and Russia for different reasons, but we haven't done that. And I believe that we need to do that. So yeah. We've got a lot of problems with China right now, and it just goes across the board. So North Korea is just an additional element to the deteriorating relationships with China, which for other reasons we need to impose the severest costs on Beijing. So yeah, I think we need to do that, and we need to just show that we're serious. You got to remember, and I understand that North Korea is not the #1 priority. But if we look at, for instance, how do you deal with a #1 priority like China? Well, you convince them that we will be successful against the Chinese if we're successful against their proxies. So for instance, if we were to have a good policy and one which had successful outcomes with regard to North Korea, it would make Beijing sit up, take notice, and maybe deal with us in better faith than they have. So I believe that, yes, you take China, you understand that is the #1 goal. You understand what Holmes says, North Korea is secondary. But when it comes to China, dealing with China, maybe North Korea is the key. So I would go after all sources of its income. And we can do this. Every dollar in the world clears in New York City. Unless you're doing a transaction in physical notes, you have to go through New York City. That means a Section 311 designation, for instance, with one of China's big 4 banks, would send the Chinese economy, the Chinese financial system into the tank, probably the political system as well. Nobody wants to do that. But if Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, felt that we were serious about this, then I think he would have a much more accommodative stance on North Korea than we've seen in the past. We just haven't convinced him that we are willing to pull the trigger. And that's what we need to do. Now, I think it's horrible that we've got ourselves into this situation, but got to remember that this is the result of years and decades of misguided policy. So any policy going forward is going to have severe costs. We've just got to figure out what's the best way to get out of this and to realize that this is a much more severe crisis than we think.
Thanks, Gordon. Bruce, I want to kick a question over to you. This is a couple of different people have asked me this, and a couple asked me to ask you specifically. You had mentioned this October 10th military parade that a lot of Korean analysts are looking at. Like I said, there's a lot of satellite imagery. People are making a lot of, I think, solid, educated guesses of what we might see. You've been looking at this for a long time. Give us your best guesstimate, if you would. What do you think on October 10th we're going to see with this military parade that's coming up?
Well, I think we have to recognize that originally with Soviet military parades and subsequently with North Korean military parades, most of the missiles we see in those parades are mock-ups. They're not actual missiles, they're mock-ups. So what are we going to see? It's hard to tell exactly what it is. Are they real missiles that exist and have some depth? Or is it just something that they have a concept of that they can model? So there is some risk of that. What we will see, though, is we'll see the transporter erector launchers. That's what we've seen before. So the launching capability, short the missile, that we should certainly see. And I'm anxious to see that. I anticipate that we're going to see more than 2 or 3 ICBM TELs, these transporter erector launchers, because I think North Korea wants us to start to believe that they have a really more significant ICBM capability. 3 or 4 ICBMs and half of them would fail in launch and some of them would get shot down. It's not a big concern. But if they have 10 or 20 or 30 ICBMs, now you get past the reliability concerns, you get past maybe some of our defenses, and they really are posing a threat to some US cities. Would they pay a serious price for doing that? Well, just as James has said, they would, but does Kim care about his urban population? Here's a regime that in the late 90s allowed somewhere between probably 500,000 and 3 million of their 20 million population to starve to death. If we go back and destroy a whole bunch of cities in North Korea, is the regime really going to care that much unless the city is Pyongyang, where they would lose their bureaucracy? So I think we have to worry about how it is that we try to deal with this regime in particular.
I think that's fair, Bruce. Let me ask a quick follow-up question about the TELs. In your opinion, do you think the North Koreans can produce their own TELs right now?
I think the answer there is, of course, we don't know. But I believe that's been a major focus for North Korea. I believe they've been working on that. Can they develop all of the components of making this very heavy vehicle that will work well? That's a really good question. But if what we see on October 10th is not 6 TELs, but is 10 or 20, then I think we got to assume that they're starting to make them, or else they have got a much thicker pipeline from China than we had evidence of before.
I think that's fair. No, thanks for that, Bruce. Let me ask this question to all of you. This is one that's been asked by a couple of different people in a few different formats. I think there's a lot of question right now. If Donald Trump was to lose the election, what a Biden administration North Korea policy would look like. I mean, seems like there's a lot of different voices that would come into the administration. You have some that may advocate for, another round of strategic patience or strategic patience 2.0. But then you get voices like Susan Rice who have made comments that maybe we can live with the nuclear North Korea. She said it in an op-ed a few years ago. So, Gordon, I'm going to ask you then, Bruce, then Dr. Holmes, what do you think a Biden policy would look like on North Korea?
I think Biden would not really pay very much attention to North Korea. I mean, remember, he was part of the Obama administration that just essentially ignored the problem. He would have other things to deal with, obviously a lot of domestic problems. But in the foreign area, I think he'd be spending much more time on China. We know from what Biden has said pre-campaign that he sees a world where the United States and China cooperate. So I think that we would go back to a John Kerry-esque policy of trying to work with Beijing on North Korea. You start to look down the line of things that a Biden administration would be caring about with regard to China. North Korea would sort of be at the bottom. Climate change would be at the top. And as in the Obama era, because they felt that obtaining Beijing's cooperation on environmental matters was more important, I think that you would find that the Biden team would very much try to deal with North Korea through China, which is exactly the opposite of what Trump is doing, which is just trying to deal with North Korea directly and cutting the Chinese out of the room.
Bruce, what do you think?
I think we have to recognize, just as Jim said, that for a Biden administration, North Korea is not going to be issue number 1 or number 2. It's going to be well down on the list, just as Gordon has just said as well. If that's the case, it is more likely that whoever the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State turn out to be will be the people making these kinds of decisions. President Biden probably is not going to think very much about North Korea. He's going to be focused on other things. Until we know who that Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense would be, it's going to be very hard to tell whether they are inclined to try to wrestle the issue of North Korea. I would hope they would, but we don't know. If they do, what I'd hope is that they start looking at practical ways, and some of them that we've discussed here, of banking enforcement, that sort of thing. But I also think we have to recognize for North Korea, their survival line right now is with ship-to-ship transfers, with oil coming in illicitly and that sort of thing. What happens if the US tells China, you stop it, or we're going to put a couple destroyers up into the northern part of the Yellow Sea and we'll start stopping it? You know, we need to start taking a hard look at what the options are to deal with that kind of thing.
Dr. Holmes, what do you think?
I think the Biden administration would have exactly the same priorities as the Trump administration. But there's actually a fun little exercise we have with our students when we talk about strategic theory. You can actually have exactly the same priorities, and if you put them in a different order, that really creates a different orientation towards policy and strategy. Just because if I care about China primarily, which I do, and North Korea is somewhere down the list. And if you or one of my fellow panelists care more about North Korea, that means we care about those. We're willing to expend more resources on it for a longer period of time. So you can actually have quite a bit of policy and strategic disagreement just by reshuffling your priorities. I couldn't agree more. I would certainly expect to see. I mean, Biden has a track record. We can go back. We can look at the members of the Obama administration, where multilateralism was big, climate change was big. I do think you would see that. You would see the same priorities, but you would definitely. Which could actually have a big impact on how we do things there. So I think that we could, and actually Bruce brought up a good point as well. We would have to watch, we know that people are policy and people are strategy. For example, if you had Michelle Flournoy as Secretary of Defense, which I think would be a very real possibility, you can have a pretty tough-minded, hawkish approach to a lot of these things. Robert Work, of course, deputy secretary in the Obama administration, much more technically oriented, a little bit less into the regional studies aspect of it as well. So it would certainly be advisable to examine who takes up places in the Biden administration, simply because that's going to help determine what we do. Oh, General Gregson, by the way, I'm standing at attention, as you can see.
Fair enough. Well, I think this is a good place to maybe end it for our discussion today. I want to thank Bruce, I want to thank Gordon, I want to thank Jim for a really great panel today. As always, we always are having these debates on North Korea in our Korea Watch section on the naturalinterest.org. I am Harry Kazianis, and I will see you all soon. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.